The last witness heard gunshots echoing through Devil's Backbone Hollow at dawn on November 15, 1871, but by the time anyone dared investigate, only silence remained in the remote Appalachian Mountains of Cullman County, Alabama. In the isolated homestead where the Bender family had carved out their existence, something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. This isn't just another tale of frontier violence. This is the story of how an entire community turned blind to horrors hiding in plain sight, and how the wilderness itself became complicit in unspeakable acts. The sound that morning was what old-timers called mountain quiet. Not the peaceful silence of nature, but the unnatural hush that follows something so wrong that even the birds refuse to sing. Martha Whitfield heard it first as she walked the ridge path to check her snares. The absence of sound, where sound should be. No chickens clucking from the Bender homestead below. No children's voices carrying on the wind. No dogs barking at strangers. Just silence, thick as fog. Martha had been avoiding the Bender place for months. Most folks in the hollow had. There were whispers, of course. There always were about families who kept to themselves too much, who smiled too wide when you caught them watching from their porch, who somehow always had meat on the table, even when hunting was poor. But whispers were cheap currency in mountain communities where survival meant minding your own business above all else. The Bender family had arrived in Cullman County 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1868. Ezra Bender, the patriarch, was a man built like a split-rail fence, all sharp angles and weathered wood. His wife Alma kept her head covered and her eyes down, speaking only when spoken to. Their 4 children ranged from 6 to 16, each one pale as creek stones and quiet as church mice. They'd claimed a plot of land in Devil's Backbone Hollow, a stretch of rocky ground that most locals considered too remote and too poor for farming. But the Benders seemed to make do. They built a cabin from native timber, cleared enough land for a small garden, and kept largely to themselves. What nobody questioned, and perhaps should have, was how a family scratching out a living on poor mountain soil always seemed to have visitors. Travelers would stop at the Bender place, drawn by the promise of a hot meal and a roof for the night. The family was known for their hospitality, their willingness to take in strangers passing through on their way to Birmingham or Huntsville. Word spread along the mountain trails that the Benders offered fair prices for room and board, and that Alma's cooking was worth the detour off the main road. But travelers who stopped at the Bender place had a curious habit of disappearing. Not all of them, of course. That would have been too obvious, too suspicious for a family trying to maintain their quiet reputation, but enough that a pattern should have emerged. If anyone had been paying attention, a peddler from Georgia who never made it to his next stop, a family of settlers whose wagon was found empty 20 miles downstream, a circuit preacher who simply vanished between Sunday services. The explanations always came easy. Mountain travel was dangerous. Wolves and bears roamed the deep woods. Creeks could rise without warning. Men sometimes decided to start fresh somewhere new, abandoning their old lives without word to anyone. In 1871, people disappeared in the Appalachian wilderness all the time. The thing about isolated communities is they develop their own logic, their own way of not seeing what they don't want to see. When Mrs. Patterson mentioned that her nephew had been heading to the Bender place and never returned, folks nodded sympathetically and suggested he'd probably decided to try his luck in the oil fields of Pennsylvania. When the shopkeeper in town noted that certain travelers never picked up supplies they'd ordered, the assumption was they'd found better deals elsewhere. Nobody wanted to believe that the quiet family in Devil's Backbone Hollow might be something other than what they appeared. But Martha Whitfield had always been more observant than most. She noticed things others missed or chose to ignore. The way smoke rose from the Bender chimney, at odd hours, thick and acrid like they were burning more than just wood. The way their property always smelled faintly of something sweet and wrong when the wind was right. The way the family's children never played with other children, never attended the traveling preacher's services, never seemed to age quite right from season to season. And she'd noticed the bones, not human bones, at least none she could identify as such. But scattered around the edges of the Bender property, half buried in leaves and undergrowth, were more animal bones than any family should accumulate. Skulls picked clean and bleached white, rib cages that seemed too large for deer, too small for cattle, fragments that might have belonged to anything or anyone. The smart thing would have been to turn around, to forget what she'd seen, to join the conspiracy of willful blindness that had allowed the Benders to operate undisturbed for 3 years. Instead, Martha Whitfield kept walking toward the silent cabin, drawn by a terrible certainty that whatever had happened in Devil's Backbone Hollow, it was finally over. But what she found there would prove that some endings are just new beginnings, and that the mountains themselves can hold secrets too dark for daylight to reach. Hey, before we dive deeper into this nightmare, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if this story's already got your attention, smash that like button and hit subscribe. Trust me, you're going to want to see where this goes. What Martha discovered in that silent cabin would haunt Cullman County for generations. But the real horror wasn't just what the Bender family had done. It was how long they'd been allowed to do it. Martha's boots crunched through frost-brittle leaves as she approached the cabin, each step echoing like a gunshot in the unnatural quiet. The discovery waiting inside would rewrite everything the mountain folk thought they knew about their neighbors. Blood doesn't lie the way people do, and the blood Martha found painted a story no amount of mountain hospitality could explain. The cabin door hung open, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Martha called out once, "Hello, the house," but her voice seemed to die just past her lips, swallowed by the same wrongness that had silenced the birds. She stepped onto the sagging porch, noting how the boards had been scrubbed recently, but still bore dark stains between the planks. Inside, the main room looked almost normal at first glance. A wooden table set for breakfast, chairs pushed back as if the family had just stepped away, a cast-iron pot hanging over cold ashes in the fireplace. But Martha's eyes, sharpened by years of tracking wounded deer, caught details others might have missed. The walls bore spatter patterns too high and too dark to be cooking grease. The floorboards had been recently mopped, but water couldn't wash away the rusty stains that had seeped between the wood joints. And there, on the table, sat a plate with half-eaten cornbread and what looked like strips of jerky, except the meat was too pale, too fine-grained to be venison. The Benders were gone, but they'd left behind evidence of their final guest. In the corner, Martha found a leather satchel torn open, its contents scattered, letters addressed to one Benjamin Hartwell of Decatur, a tintype photograph of a young woman holding a baby, a small Bible with B.H. inscribed in fading ink on the first page, and folded carefully beneath the Bible, a bill of sale for farm equipment, dated November 14th, just 1 day ago. Benjamin Hartwell had been a traveling merchant, carrying goods and taking orders throughout the Alabama Hill Country. His route was well known among the mountain families, and his arrival was always welcomed. He was the kind of man who brought news from the outside world, who carried letters between isolated homesteads, who could be trusted with precious coins and important messages. He was also exactly the kind of victim the Benders preferred. A search of the cabin revealed more disturbing details. In the back room, Martha discovered a collection of personal effects that clearly belonged to different people: a woman's wedding ring, a child's wooden toy, a man's pocket watch with an inscription from "Your loving wife, Sarah." Each item told the story of a life cut short, of travelers who had trusted the wrong family with their final night. But most chilling was what Martha found in the cellar. The wooden steps creaked ominously as she descended into the root cellar, guided by pale morning light filtering through the open door above. The air down there was thick with the smell of earth and something else, something metallic and sweet that made her stomach turn. The cellar had been used for its intended purpose. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars of preserved vegetables and smoked meat. Too much smoked meat for a family that kept no livestock. The jars were labeled in Alma Bender's careful handwriting. Pork shoulder, Sept. 71. Beef strips, Aug. 71. Venison roast, July 71. But Martha had lived in these mountains her entire life. She knew what deer meat looked like, what bear fat smelled like, what properly cured pork felt like between her fingers. This wasn't any of those things. In the far corner of the cellar, partially hidden behind a stack of empty barrels, Martha discovered the Bender's butchering station, a heavy wooden table, its surface dark and scarred from countless cuts, iron hooks suspended from the ceiling beams, a collection of knives and cleavers arranged with surgical precision, and scattered around the base of the table, bone fragments too varied to have come from any single type of animal. The mountain families had been buying their winter meat from the Benders for 3 years. Alma Bender's venison had fed dozens of households through harsh mountain winters. Children had grown strong on her beef stew. Men had praised the tenderness of her pork roasts. Nobody had ever asked why the meat tasted different from what they caught themselves. As Martha stood in that blood-soaked cellar, surrounded by the evidence of systematic horror, she realized the true scope of what had been happening in Devil's Backbone Hollow. This wasn't the work of desperate people driven to a single act of violence. This was a carefully planned operation that had been running for years, feeding an entire community while slowly consuming the travelers who passed through their remote corner of Alabama. The sound of approaching horses broke Martha's horrified trance. Through the small cellar window, she could see a group of men riding up the hollow, the local sheriff and several volunteers, drawn by reports of the gunshots heard at dawn. But as Martha climbed back up those creaking stairs, a terrible question haunted her steps. In a community where everyone had unknowingly participated in the Benders' crimes, who could be trusted to seek justice? The deeper truth was still buried in those Alabama mountains, waiting to surface like bones after a hard rain. Sheriff Thomas McCready dismounted his horse with the slow deliberation of a man who'd seen too much frontier violence, but nothing had prepared him for what Martha Whitfield was about to show him. The badge on his chest had kept the peace in Cullman County for 8 years, but today it would become a symbol of willful ignorance. When good men choose to look away, evil doesn't just survive, it thrives, and the Bender family had counted on that human weakness for far too long. McCready was a practical man, built thick through the shoulders from years of farm work before taking up the law. He'd ridden out to Devil's Backbone Hollow, expecting to find the aftermath of a family dispute, maybe a hunting accident. Mountain folk were known for settling their differences with gunpowder, and the Benders had always seemed like the type to keep their problems private. What he found instead was Martha Whitfield standing in the cabin doorway, her face pale as winter sky, gesturing toward the open cellar entrance with trembling hands. "Sheriff," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you need to see what's down there." The 4 men McCready had brought with him, Deputy Morrison, Doc Henley, and 2 local farmers, clustered nervously behind their horses. They'd all heard the stories about the Bender place, the whispered suspicions that had circulated for months, but suspicion was different from proof, and proof was what stared back at them from the depths of that blood-soaked cellar. Doc Henley, who delivered half the babies in the county and sewn up more gunshot wounds than he cared to count, emerged from the cellar after 10 minutes looking like he'd aged 10 years. "Tom," he said quietly, "we're going to need help from the state marshal. This is bigger than anything we can handle." But Sheriff McCready was already thinking about containment, not justice. The problem wasn't just what the Benders had done, it was how many people had unknowingly been complicit in their crimes. Half the families in the county had bought meat from Alma Bender over the past 3 years. Children had been fed. Elderly folks had survived harsh winters. Wedding feasts had been celebrated, with food that came from the Bender cellar. How do you tell an entire community that they'd been cannibals without knowing it? McCready made his decision quickly, the way lawmen learn to do when faced with problems too big for conventional solutions. "Doc, I want you to examine everything down there, but keep your findings to yourself for now. Morrison, ride back to town and send word to the families. Tell them the Benders have fled the county, probably headed south toward Mississippi. Nothing more." "But Sheriff," Martha protested, "what about Benjamin Hartwell? What about all the others?" McCready fixed her with a hard stare. "Martha, you found an empty cabin and some scattered belongings. Folks sometimes leave in a hurry when debts come calling. That's all anyone needs to know until we sort this out proper." The cover-up began immediately, born not from corruption, but from a kind of moral cowardice that plagues small communities when the truth becomes too terrible to bear. Within hours, the official story had crystallized. The Bender family had abandoned their homestead under cover of darkness, probably fleeing debts or family troubles. Any missing travelers in the area were victims of the dangerous mountain terrain, not human predators. But sanitizing the official record couldn't erase what Doc Henley had cataloged in his private notes. That evening, in the privacy of his study, Doc Henley recorded what he'd found in the Bender cellar. His handwriting, usually neat and precise, grew increasingly erratic as he documented the evidence. November 15th, 1871, examination of Bender property reveals extensive butchering operation. Multiple sets of human remains in various stages of processing. Conservative estimate, 12 to 15 victims over past 3 years. Ages ranging from child to elderly. Evidence suggests systematic harvesting of human flesh for consumption and sale. Personal effects found include items belonging to Benjamin Hartwell, merchant; Sarah Collins, widow traveling to family; Timothy Walsh, circuit preacher; the Morrison children, family of settlers; and numerous unidentified individuals. Conclusion: the Bender family operated a murder-for-profit enterprise, selling human flesh disguised as game meat to local population. Community unknowingly participated in cannibalistic consumption for extended period. Doc Henley sealed his notes in an envelope and locked them in his desk drawer. Like Sheriff McCready, he understood that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. Meanwhile, the physical evidence was being systematically destroyed. Working through the night by lantern light, McCready and his men cleared the Bender cellar of its grisly contents. The butchering tools were thrown down an abandoned mine shaft. The jars of preserved meat were smashed and buried in a pit behind the cabin. The bone fragments were scattered throughout the dense woods, where time and weather would eventually turn them to dust. By dawn on November 16th, Devil's Backbone Hollow looked like nothing more than an abandoned homestead, another casualty of the hard mountain life. But erasing evidence couldn't erase memory, and the Benders had made one critical mistake that would eventually expose the full scope of their crimes. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in their bedroom, Martha had discovered something McCready's cleanup crew had missed. Alma Bender's diary, written in the careful script of a woman who believed her family's work was not just necessary, but righteous. The diary would eventually find its way into hands that cared more about truth than community peace, setting in motion events that would shake Cullman County to its foundations. But for now, in the immediate aftermath of discovery, the conspiracy of silence held firm, protected by good men who convinced themselves that some secrets were too dark for daylight. What those men didn't understand was that the Bender family's work in Alabama had been just one chapter in a much longer, darker story. 3 weeks after the official abandonment of Devil's Backbone Hollow, Martha Whitfield returned to the empty cabin with a crowbar and a lantern. Driven by questions that Sheriff McCready's hasty cleanup had left unanswered, what she pried from beneath those floorboards would prove that some horrors are too methodical to be mere madness. Evil, when it keeps careful records, reveals patterns that transform isolated incidents into systematic campaigns of terror. Martha had been haunted by inconsistencies in the official story. If the Benders had fled in panic, why was their cabin so thoroughly cleaned? If they'd left voluntarily, why abandon valuable personal possessions? And most troubling of all, why had she found Benjamin Hartwell's torn satchel but no sign of Benjamin himself? The answers lay wrapped in oiled cloth beneath the bedroom floor, protected from moisture and decay by a woman who understood the importance of preserving family history. Alma Bender's diary spanned 4 years, beginning with her family's arrival in Kansas Territory in 1867. The early entries read like those of any pioneer woman: complaints about the weather, pride in her children's growth, concerns about making ends meet on the frontier. But as Martha read deeper into the journal by flickering lantern light, the entries began to reveal a darkness that grew more confident with each passing month. May 23rd, 1867, Pan, Kansas Territory. Ezra says we must be practical about survival. The drought has killed our crops, and the nearest neighbor is 20 miles away. When the peddler stopped yesterday, weak from hunger, Ezra saw an opportunity. I told him it was wrong, but when your children are starving, morality becomes a luxury you cannot afford. The transformation from desperate survival to calculated murder was documented in careful detail across dozens of entries. Martha learned that the Benders had operated a similar scheme in Kansas for 2 years before authorities began asking uncomfortable questions about missing travelers. They'd fled to Alabama in the spring of 1868, carrying with them not just experience, but a refined methodology for selecting, killing, and processing their victims. Alma's entries revealed a disturbing pride in their work. September 14th, 1869 NSAX, Alabama. The traveling preacher provided excellent yield. Ezra has improved his technique considerably since Kansas. Clean cuts, minimal waste, proper aging. The meat will feed us through winter and provide surplus for trade. The children are growing strong on good protein. November 3rd, 1869, sold 2 hams to the Patterson family today. Mrs. Patterson complimented the flavor, said it was the best pork she'd ever tasted. If only she knew the care we take in selection and preparation. Our guests are chosen for quality, young, healthy, and well-fed. The Mountain families deserve the finest. But the diary revealed more than just the mechanics of murder. It exposed a twisted philosophy that had allowed the Benders to rationalize their crimes as a form of community service. According to Alma's writings, the family viewed themselves as providers, feeding the hungry mountain population with protein they could never afford otherwise. Travelers were abundant and temporary. The local families were permanent neighbors who deserved sustenance. The Benders saw themselves as redistributing resources from those who had plenty to those who had nothing. February 17th, 1870. The merchant from Huntsville brought news of abundant trade routes opening through our territory. More travelers means more opportunities to serve our community. Ezra estimates we can process 1 guest per month without arousing suspicion. The children are learning to help with preparation. This work requires family commitment. The most chilling aspect of the diary wasn't the description of murders, but the careful business planning that surrounded them. The Benders had developed a sophisticated operation over their years in Kansas and Alabama. They advertised their hospitality at trading posts and general stores throughout the region. They cultivated relationships with local families, building trust through generous gifts of game meat and helpful community participation. They even maintained correspondence with criminal contacts in other states, sharing techniques and warning each other about law enforcement activity. Martha discovered that Devil's Backbone Hollow had been just one location in a network of similar operations stretching across the frontier. August 12th, 1870. Letter from cousin Wilhelm in Missouri confirms good harvest season there. His family processed 6 guests last month without incident. The railroad is bringing more travelers through his territory. Meanwhile, our Alabama operation continues steady. 2 processors per month during travel season, 1 during winter months. Quality remains high. The diary also revealed why the Benders had suddenly abandoned their Alabama operation. It wasn't panic or debt that drove them away. It was intelligence about incoming federal investigation. November 10th, 1,871 word from Kansas contacts that federal marshals are reviewing missing person reports across multiple territories. Our former neighbors near Cherryvale are under scrutiny. Ezra says we must relocate before attention turns south. The children are disappointed to leave their friends, but family survival requires mobility. As Martha read the final entries by guttering lamplight, she realized the full scope of what Sheriff McCready had covered up. The Benders hadn't been isolated killers, driven by desperation. They'd been part of an organized criminal enterprise that had operated across multiple states for over 4 years. Their Alabama victims weren't random casualties of frontier violence, but carefully selected targets in a calculated business model. More disturbing still was the implication that similar operations might be active in other remote locations, feeding unsuspecting communities, while authorities looked the other way. Martha closed the diary with trembling hands, understanding that the horror of Devil's Backbone Hollow had been just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. The Benders had escaped justice in Alabama, but their careful record suggested they would surface again in another remote location, serving another hungry community. The question was whether anyone with the power to stop them would have the courage to look beyond the comfortable lies that local authorities preferred to tell themselves. Outside the empty cabin, storm clouds gathered over the Alabama mountains, and Martha Whitfield realized she held evidence that could expose a criminal network spanning half the American frontier. Marshal James Patterson arrived in Cullman County on December 3, 1871, carrying a leather satchel full of missing person reports and a reputation for seeing through local cover-ups. His questions would force the mountain community to confront a truth they'd spent weeks trying to bury. When federal authority meets local conspiracy, the collision often reveals how far ordinary people will go to protect their own complicity in extraordinary crimes. Patterson was a methodical man, trained in the systematic approach that federal law enforcement was beginning to develop in the post-war era. Unlike local sheriffs, who knew every family for 3 generations, he brought the cold objectivity of an outsider who owed no favors and feared no social consequences. His investigation into missing travelers had led him from Kansas through Missouri and Arkansas, following a trail of disappeared persons that seemed to cluster around certain remote communities. The pattern was always the same: isolated homesteads offering hospitality to travelers, local authorities explaining disappearances as accidents or voluntary departures, and communities that seemed unusually well-fed despite economic hardship. Sheriff McCready met Patterson at the county courthouse with the practiced cordiality of a man hoping to appear helpful while revealing nothing useful. "Marshal, I wish I could be more assistance, but we've had remarkably little trouble with missing persons in our jurisdiction. Mountain travel is dangerous, of course, but our folks are generally law-abiding." Patterson spread his reports across McCready's desk with deliberate precision. Benjamin Hartwell, merchant from Decatur, last confirmed sighting November 14th at your local trading post, asking directions to a homestead in Devil's Backbone Hollow. Timothy Walsh, circuit preacher, disappeared 3 months earlier after visiting the same area. The Morrison family, 5 members, including 3 children, vanished in August while traveling through your county. Like I said, Marshal, mountain travel is dangerous, Patterson finished. So I've been told in every county from here to Kansas. Remarkably dangerous, considering how many travelers seem to disappear in the exact same locations. That afternoon, Patterson rode out to Devil's Backbone Hollow with a small team of federal investigators. What he found was a crime scene that had been sanitized with suspicious thoroughness. The Bender cabin showed clear signs of recent cleaning. Floors scrubbed, walls whitewashed, cellars swept clean of debris. But Patterson's team included men trained in the new scientific methods of criminal investigation. They found traces of blood that soap couldn't remove, scratches on the cellar floor that suggested heavy objects had been dragged across the wood, and soil disturbances that indicated recent burial activity. More importantly, they found Martha Whitfield. Martha had been waiting for someone like Patterson to arrive, someone with the authority and objectivity to hear what she'd discovered. She led the federal team to her house and presented them with Alma Bender's diary, explaining how she'd found it and why she'd hidden it from local authorities. Patterson read selected passages aloud to his team, his voice growing grimmer with each entry. The diary provided evidence, not just of the Alabama murders, but of a multi-state criminal enterprise that had been operating for years while local authorities looked the other way. "Gentlemen," Patterson said, closing the diary, "we're not dealing with an isolated family of killers. We're looking at organized crime on a scale that crosses territorial boundaries." The investigation expanded rapidly once Patterson had Alma's diary as evidence. Federal agents were dispatched to locations mentioned in the journal Missouri, Arkansas, Kansas, and Indian Territory. Telegraph messages flew between law enforcement agencies, coordinating information about missing persons and suspicious homesteads. For the first time, the scattered reports of disappeared travelers were being viewed as pieces of a single, massive puzzle. In Kansas, agents discovered that the Benders had indeed operated near Cherryvale, using the same methods they'd later employed in Alabama. Local authorities there had been asking questions, but the family had vanished before arrests could be made. Property records showed they'd sold their Kansas homestead just 3 weeks before appearing in Alabama. More disturbing was evidence that the Bender network extended beyond a single family. Alma's diary contained references to cousin Wilhelm in Missouri and the Arkansas operation, suggesting a loosely connected network of criminals using similar methods across the frontier. Each group operated independently but shared information about law enforcement activity, profitable locations, and victim selection techniques. Patterson realized he was investigating not just a series of murders, but an early form of organized crime that had adapted to the unique conditions of frontier America. The communities where these operations functioned shared certain characteristics: remote locations with sparse law enforcement, poverty that made additional food sources welcome, and social structures that discouraged asking too many questions about neighbors' private business. The criminals had identified vulnerable populations and systematically exploited their willingness to accept help without scrutiny. But Patterson's investigation faced a fundamental obstacle that would ultimately limit its effectiveness. While he could document what had happened and identify the perpetrators, actually prosecuting the crimes required cooperation from local communities that had every reason to avoid federal attention. The people of Cullman County weren't just witnesses to the Benders' crimes. They were unwitting accomplices who had consumed the evidence and spread it throughout their families. How do you put an entire community on trial for cannibalism they didn't know they were committing? Patterson understood that successful prosecution would require exposing facts that could destroy dozens of families and create social chaos throughout the mountain region. Children would learn their parents had fed them human flesh. Neighbors would become suspicious of neighbors. The social fabric that held these isolated communities together would unravel completely. Sheriff McCready made this calculation explicit during a private meeting with the federal marshal. "You can pursue this investigation anywhere you want, Patterson, but understand what you're really doing. You're not just hunting criminals who've already escaped. You're destroying innocent people who never knew they were victims." The weight of that truth would influence every decision Patterson made as his investigation deepened into the winter of 1871. As snow began to fall on the Alabama mountains, the federal marshal faced a choice between justice and mercy that would define not just his career, but the future of an entire region. The telegram arrived at Patterson's field office on January 7, 1872, bearing news that would crack open the entire frontier killing network. Bender family located Cherryvale, Kansas, under federal custody, request immediate assistance. The hunters had become the hunted, but their capture would reveal horrors that made Alabama look like a dress rehearsal. When criminals who believe they're untouchable finally face justice, the confessions that follow often expose depths of depravity that beggar imagination. The arrest had come through methodical police work rather than dramatic confrontation. Federal agents in Kansas had been monitoring telegraph communications and bank transactions, following the paper trail that organized criminals always leave behind despite their careful planning. The Benders had made the mistake of trying to sell property too quickly after fleeing Alabama, creating a suspicious pattern that drew federal attention. They were found operating under assumed names in a boarding house outside Cherryvale, already scouting locations for their next operation. Ezra had been posing as a livestock buyer, Alma as a seamstress seeking work, while their children attended local school under false identities. Within 3 weeks of leaving Alabama, they'd begun the process of establishing themselves in a new community. But this time, federal agents were watching. Patterson took the first available train north, carrying Alma's diary and a growing file of evidence linking the Alabama operation to similar crimes across the frontier. The journey gave him time to prepare for interrogations that would either validate his theory about an organized network or reveal the Benders as isolated killers whose crimes had been exaggerated by circumstantial evidence. What he found in the Kansas federal courthouse exceeded his worst expectations. Under interrogation, Ezra Bender proved to be a man who viewed murder as simply another form of frontier commerce. He spoke about victim selection with the dispassionate analysis of a businessman discussing inventory management. Young, healthy travelers provided the best yield. Families with children created disposal problems. Single men with limited social connections posed the lowest risk of investigation. "You have to understand," Ezra explained to Patterson during their first formal interview, "we provided a service to those communities. Folks were starving, and we had access to protein they couldn't afford otherwise. We redistributed resources from people who had plenty to people who had nothing." The casual rationalization was chilling, but Ezra's revelations about the broader network were worse. Under federal pressure, he began naming associates across multiple states. The cousin Wilhelm in Missouri mentioned in Alma's diary was Wilhelm Gebhardt, who operated a similar scheme near Springfield with his 3 sons. The Arkansas operation was run by a family named Dvorak, who had processed an estimated 23 victims over 18 months before moving to Texas. Most disturbing was Ezra's description of how the network communicated and coordinated their activities. The families maintained contact through coded letters sent via traveling merchants and circuit preachers. They shared information about law enforcement activity, profitable locations, and operational techniques. When one operation became too risky, the others would provide temporary shelter and assistance in relocating. It was primitive organized crime, adapted to the unique conditions of frontier America. "We learned from each other," Ezra continued, apparently unaware that each revelation was sealing his fate. Wilhelm developed better preservation methods. The Dvoraks perfected guest selection. My family contributed distribution techniques that kept communities satisfied without asking questions. Patterson realized he was documenting not just a series of murders, but an early form of criminal enterprise that had successfully operated across territorial boundaries for over 5 years. Federal agents coordinated simultaneous raids on the Missouri and Arkansas operations based on Ezra's information. The results confirmed the scope of what they were facing. In Missouri, the Gebhardt family had processed an estimated 37 victims over 3 years. selling human flesh disguised as game meat to surrounding communities. Their cellar contained preservation equipment that suggested industrial-scale processing capabilities. The Arkansas operation had been even more sophisticated. The Dvorak family had established relationships with 3 different communities, rotating their sales territory to avoid creating suspicion in any single location. They'd also developed a crude but effective early warning system, using traveling associates to monitor law enforcement activity across the region. But the most shocking discovery came from searching the criminal's correspondence. Among Wilhelm Gebhardt's papers, federal agents found letters indicating that the network had been planning expansion into California and Oregon territory, taking advantage of increased travel along the western trails. They'd identified mining communities and railroad construction camps as ideal target markets, populations with steady cash flow and limited law enforcement oversight. The Bender network hadn't been winding down when federal investigation began. They'd been scaling up. Patterson's interrogation of Alma Bender revealed the psychological framework that had allowed ordinary people to become systematic killers. She spoke about their work with the pride of a homemaker, discussing her family's successful farm operation. To her mind, they'd built a sustainable business that served community needs while providing for their children's futures. "We were good neighbors," she insisted during one particularly disturbing interview session. "We helped people through hard times. We fed children who would have gone hungry otherwise. When travelers stopped at our place, they served a purpose even after they died." The complete absence of guilt or recognition that murder was morally wrong suggested a level of psychological adaptation that federal investigators had never encountered. These weren't desperate people driven to isolated acts of violence. They were entrepreneurs who had identified a market opportunity and systematically exploited it for years. As winter deepened across the frontier, Patterson compiled evidence that would eventually result in federal prosecution of the largest organized crime network in American territorial history. But even as the legal machinery ground into motion, he understood that justice for the victims would be incomplete. The network had been broken, but its legacy lived on in the communities that had unknowingly participated in its crimes, and in the countless unmarked graves scattered across the American frontier. Death leaves evidence, but some secrets stay buried until the earth itself reveals them. The federal courthouse in Topeka, Kansas, filled to capacity on March 15, 1872, as the most shocking trial in frontier history began with testimony that would make grown men weep and force a nation to confront the darkness lurking in its remote corners. What unfolded over the next 3 weeks would forever change how America viewed the untamed wilderness and the people who claimed to civilize it. When evil wears the mask of hospitality, justice must tear away every pretense to reveal the monster underneath. The prosecution's case was led by Federal Attorney General George Williams himself, who had traveled from Washington specifically to handle what newspapers were calling the Cannibal Network trial. Williams understood that this case would set precedents for how federal law enforcement dealt with organized crime that crossed territorial boundaries, making it as much about legal principle as criminal justice. The courtroom was packed with journalists from major newspapers, federal officials, local law enforcement, and curiosity seekers who had traveled hundreds of miles to witness the proceedings. Outside, vendors sold pamphlets containing sensationalized accounts of the crimes, while sketch artists captured images of the defendants for distribution to newspapers across the country. The Bender family sat in the defendant's dock with an eerie composure that unsettled observers. Ezra maintained the bearing of a successful businessman, occasionally taking notes as if attending a livestock auction. Alma wore her best dress and kept her hands folded, looking like any respectable frontier wife. Their children, now ranging from 9 to 19, seemed confused by the proceedings but showed no visible distress. Williams opened with a presentation of physical evidence that left the courtroom in stunned silence. He displayed jars of preserved meat found in the various network locations, tools used for butchering, and personal effects taken from victims. But the most damning evidence was documentary. Alma's diary, business correspondence between network families, and detailed accounting records that treated human lives as inventory items. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Williams declared, "we are not here to judge desperate people driven to isolated acts of violence. We are here to examine a calculated criminal enterprise that operated across multiple states, systematically murdering innocent travelers and feeding their flesh to unsuspecting communities for over 5 years." The prosecution's first witness was Martha Whitfield, who described her discovery of the Alabama operation with devastating clarity. Her testimony was factual and measured, but the horror of what she described, the blood-soaked cellar, the preserved human flesh, the careful records of murdered victims, created a palpable tension in the courtroom. More powerful still was the testimony of Dr. James Morrison, a frontier physician who had examined the remains found at various network locations. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Morrison testified, "the victims were systematically processed using methods designed to maximize yield while minimizing waste. The butchering technique shows clear evidence of experience and planning. These were not crimes of passion, but deliberate acts performed by individuals who had refined their methods over time." When Williams presented the accounting records kept by Wilhelm Gebhardt, the Missouri operation leader, even hardened court observers were shaken. The ledgers contained entries like processed merchandise, January batch 47 pounds usable product, and community distribution, February, Springfield families, 12 units sold, excellent feedback. The defendants had reduced human beings to inventory numbers and profit margins, but the most devastating testimony came from surviving associates who had been granted immunity in exchange for cooperation. Thomas Kellerman, a traveling merchant who had unknowingly carried communications between network families, described the sophisticated system they'd developed for sharing information and coordinating activities. "They knew exactly what they were doing," Kellerman testified. "When one location got too risky, they'd move the whole operation somewhere new. They had contacts in 6 states, safe houses for temporary shelter, and methods for creating new identities. It wasn't random killing. It was organized business." The defense, led by attorney Samuel Crawford, faced an impossible task, creating reasonable doubt in the face of overwhelming evidence. Crawford's strategy focused on portraying the defendants as victims of frontier desperation rather than calculating criminals. "My clients were driven to desperate acts by circumstances beyond their control," Crawford argued. "Frontier life demanded harsh choices for survival. They provided sustenance to starving communities when no other resources were available. While their methods were extreme, their intentions were to serve their neighbors and provide for their families." The defense called witnesses who testified about the harsh conditions of frontier life, the frequency of starvation during bad seasons, and the gratitude that mountain communities had expressed for the Benders' generosity. Several character witnesses described Alma as a devoted mother and Ezra as a helpful neighbor who had assisted with barn raisings and community projects. But Crawford's arguments collapsed under cross-examination when Williams presented evidence of the network's business planning and expansion efforts. The prosecution revealed that the network had been accumulating significant cash reserves, over $3,000 found in various hiding places, an enormous sum for frontier families. They'd been investing in improved equipment, scouting new territories, and recruiting additional associates. This wasn't desperate survival. It was profitable enterprise that happened to involve murder. Most damning was testimony about the network's victim selection process. Evidence showed they'd specifically targeted travelers with valuable goods, avoided killing people whose disappearance would trigger investigation, and maintained detailed profiles of potential victims who frequented their territories. As the trial progressed through its second week, public opinion shifted from horror to demands for the harshest possible punishment. Newspaper editorials called for hanging, while religious leaders denounced the defendants as embodiments of frontier evil that threatened civilized society. The testimony phase concluded, with Ezra Bender taking the stand in his own defense, a decision that would seal his fate and provide the most chilling moments of the entire trial. Under questioning from his own attorney, Ezra maintained that his family had provided essential services to communities that would have starved without their assistance. But under cross-examination from Williams, his true nature emerged with terrifying clarity. "Did you feel any remorse when killing these innocent people?" Williams asked. "Remorse for what?" Ezra replied with genuine confusion. "We provided good meat to hungry families. Those travelers served a purpose even after they died. That's more useful than most people manage in their entire lives." The courtroom erupted in shouting and had to be cleared by federal marshals, but the damage was done. Ezra Bender had revealed himself as a man completely divorced from normal human morality, someone who viewed murder as simply another form of resource management. As the trial moved toward closing arguments, everyone present understood they had witnessed something unprecedented in American legal history: the systematic documentation of organized evil that had flourished in the shadows of frontier expansion. The verdict would determine not just the fate of the defendants, but how a growing nation would confront the darkness that civilization's advance had left in its wake. The jury deliberated for exactly 47 minutes on April 2, 1872, returning verdicts that would echo through American legal history: guilty on all charges of murder, conspiracy, and federal crimes across state lines. But even as justice was finally served, the shadow of the Bender Network would prove longer and darker than anyone imagined. When monsters face the gallows, their final words often reveal truths that civilized society would prefer to forget forever. The courtroom remained silent as Judge William Lawrence read the sentences with measured gravity. Ezra Bender, death by hanging. Alma Bender, death by hanging. Their eldest son, 19-year-old John Bender, life imprisonment. The younger children, deemed too young to fully understand their participation, were sentenced to reform school until age 21. But it was Ezra's response to his death sentence that would haunt everyone present. Standing with the calm dignity of a man attending a business meeting, Ezra looked directly at Judge Lawrence and said, "Your Honor, we fed more families than most charitable organizations. We kept communities alive through hard winters. The only difference between us and any butcher shop is we didn't advertise our source." The judge's gavel cracked like a gunshot as he restored order to the erupting courtroom. But Ezra's words captured a disturbing truth that would complicate the narrative of simple justice that newspapers preferred to tell. The executions were scheduled for May 10, 1872, in the federal prison yard at Fort Leavenworth. But even as the legal machinery moved toward its conclusion, Marshall Patterson continued uncovering evidence that the network's reach had been far greater than anyone realized. Federal agents, following leads from the trial, discovered additional operations in Colorado Territory, Nevada, and California. The network hadn't just been a collection of isolated families. It had been a criminal organization with sophisticated communication systems, shared resources, and coordinated expansion plans that stretched from Kansas to the Pacific coast. Most disturbing was evidence that some community leaders had known more than they'd admitted. In several locations, agents found correspondence between network families and local merchants, postmasters, and even some law enforcement officials who had provided information about travelers' movements, schedules, and cargo. While not directly complicit in murder, these individuals had knowingly assisted the operations in exchange for steady supplies of cheap meat. The trial had exposed not just individual criminals, but systemic corruption that allowed organized crime to flourish in remote territories where federal oversight was minimal. On the morning of May 10th, nearly 2,000 spectators gathered outside Fort Leavenworth to witness the executions. Among them were family members of victims, survivors from communities that had unknowingly consumed human flesh, and curiosity seekers drawn by the sensational nature of the crimes. Alma Binder went to the gallows first, maintaining her composure until the final moment when she turned to the crowd and shouted, "We were good neighbors. We helped people." The trapdoor opened before she could say more. Ezra's execution proved more dramatic. He used his final statement to deliver a 5-minute speech that chilled observers with its complete absence of remorse or recognition that murder was morally wrong. "I fed children who would have starved," he declared. "I kept families alive through winters that would have killed them. Every person we processed served a purpose greater than their individual lives. That's more charity than most Christians manage." When asked if he had any final words for the families of his victims, Ezra's response would be quoted in newspapers across the country. "They should thank us. Their loved ones didn't die for nothing. They died to feed the hungry." The trapdoor silenced him mid-sentence, but his words would echo through American consciousness for decades to come. The immediate aftermath of the executions brought little satisfaction to those who had suffered from the network's crimes. Families in Alabama, Missouri, Arkansas, and other affected areas faced the ongoing trauma of knowing they had unknowingly participated in cannibalism. Children grew up learning that meals they'd enjoyed had been prepared from human flesh. Communities that had once celebrated together could no longer trust their own memories. Marshall Patterson's final report to federal authorities documented 37 confirmed victims across the network's operations, but acknowledged that the true number was likely much higher. Many travelers who had disappeared in remote areas over the previous 5 years might have been victims whose deaths were attributed to natural hazards rather than murder. More troubling was evidence that similar operations might still be active in territories where federal investigation had not yet reached. The Bender trial established important legal precedents for federal prosecution of crimes that crossed territorial boundaries, but it also revealed the limitations of law enforcement in vast, sparsely populated regions where communities often preferred local solutions to outside intervention. In the months following the executions, reports began surfacing of other suspicious operations in remote areas. Federal agents investigated claims of mysterious disappearances near isolated homesteads, communities that seemed unusually well-fed despite economic hardship, and families who offered suspicious hospitality to travelers. Some investigations revealed legitimate criminal activity and resulted in additional prosecutions. Others uncovered nothing more than frontier families trying to survive harsh conditions through legitimate, if unconventional, means. But the Bender case had created a climate of suspicion that would permanently change how Americans viewed remote communities and frontier hospitality. The network's legacy extended beyond its immediate crimes to influence the development of federal law enforcement capabilities and interterritorial communication systems. The case demonstrated the need for coordinated investigation methods and information sharing between jurisdictions, innovations that would eventually evolve into modern federal crime-fighting techniques. But perhaps the most lasting impact was psychological. The Bender network had shattered the romantic mythology of frontier life as a noble struggle between civilization and wilderness. Instead, it revealed how isolation could breed horrors that civilized society preferred not to acknowledge, and how ordinary people could become complicit in extraordinary evil through willful ignorance and desperate need. As America continued its westward expansion, the shadow of Devil's Backbone Hollow would follow, a reminder that monsters don't always announce themselves with fangs and claws. Sometimes they serve dinner with a smile and ask only that their guests not inquire too closely about the source of their hospitality. Even today, locals in certain remote areas of Alabama claim you can still smell something sweet and wrong when the wind shifts toward Devil's Backbone Hollow, and that sometimes, on foggy nights, you can hear the sound of someone calling travelers in for supper. The demolition crew arrived at Devil's Backbone Hollow On October 13, 1872, with orders to level the Bender cabin and salt the earth where it stood. But what they unearthed beneath the foundation would prove that some horrors refused to stay buried. The final chapter of the Bender story was written not in courtrooms or newspapers, but in the bones that had been waiting decades to tell their tale. Evil doesn't end with executions. It leaves echoes that resonate through generations, waiting for the right moment to surface and remind the living that justice delayed is not always justice denied. The decision to destroy the cabin had come from federal authorities who understood that the site had become a morbid attraction. Curiosity seekers traveled from across the country to see where the cannibal network had operated, turning Devil's Backbone Hollow into a destination for the ghoulish tourism that sensational crimes inevitably inspire. Local residents supported the demolition for different reasons. They wanted the physical reminder of their community's unwitting participation in cannibalism erased from the landscape. Children had grown up learning that meals they'd enjoyed contained human flesh, and the cabin's continued existence made forgetting impossible. But the earth beneath the Bender homestead held secrets that no amount of demolition could erase. When the work crew began excavating the foundation, they immediately encountered evidence that the federal investigation had been incomplete. The carefully documented cellar, where Martha Whitfield had discovered the butchering operation, was only the most recent layer of a much older horror. Beneath the cabin's floorboards, workers found a network of connected cellars and storage chambers that predated the Bender family's arrival by decades. The construction techniques and tool marks suggested the underground complex had been built in the 1840s or earlier, meaning the site had been used for similar purposes long before Ezra and Alma claimed the property. The implications were staggering. Devil's Backbone Hollow had been a killing ground for nearly 30 years. Examination of the deeper excavations revealed multiple layers of human remains, processed and stored using methods that evolved over time. The earliest deposits showed crude butchering techniques and simple preservation methods. Later layers demonstrated increasingly sophisticated processing capabilities, culminating in the industrial-scale operation that the Benders had perfected. Dr. Morrison, the physician who had testified at the trial, was called in to examine the discoveries. His analysis painted a picture of systematic murder that spanned multiple generations and possibly multiple families. Based on the variety of processing techniques and tool marks, Dr. Morrison reported, "This site was used by different operators over an extended period. The Bender family inherited an established operation and refined it, but they were not the originators of the crimes committed here." The discovery raised disturbing questions about the true scope of frontier cannibalism and the possibility that similar sites existed throughout remote areas of the American wilderness. Federal investigators reopened their examination of the broader network, searching for evidence of other long-term operations that might have been passed down through families or criminal associations. What they found suggested that the Bender network had been built on foundations laid by earlier generations of killers who had discovered the same truth. Isolated communities with limited law enforcement were ideal environments for systematic murder. But the most shocking discovery came from examining personal effects found in the deepest layers of the Devil's Backbone site. Among the oldest remains, investigators found artifacts that connected the site to the Cherokee removal of 1838. Documents, jewelry, and personal items suggested that some of the earliest victims had been Native Americans who had been murdered while traveling the Trail of Tears, people whose disappearance would never have been investigated by territorial authorities. The revelation added a dimension of racial violence to crimes that investigators had previously understood as purely opportunistic. The site's operators had systematically targeted the most vulnerable populations, travelers with no local connections, minority groups whose deaths wouldn't trigger investigation, and people whose absence could be easily explained by the dangers of frontier travel. As excavation continued through the winter of 1872, the scope of the Devil's Backbone operation became clear. Conservative estimates suggested that over 100 people had been murdered at the site over a 30-year period, making it one of the largest serial killing locations in American history. The victims represented a cross-section of frontier America: Cherokee families forced from their ancestral lands, freed slaves seeking new opportunities in the West, European immigrants pursuing homestead dreams, traveling merchants and craftsmen, circuit preachers and teachers, and entire families who had simply chosen the wrong place to seek shelter for the night. Each set of remains told a story of trust betrayed and hospitality weaponized for murder. Federal authorities faced a decision about how to handle discoveries that could fundamentally alter public understanding of frontier history. The romantic narrative of westward expansion as a heroic struggle between civilization and wilderness became more complicated when evidence suggested that some of the worst horrors had been perpetrated by people claiming to represent civilized values. The decision was made to limit public disclosure of the full scope of the Devil's Backbone discoveries. Official reports acknowledged the existence of additional remains, but provided few details about the timeline or scale of the operation. The site was declared a federal investigation area. Access was restricted, and most of the evidence was sealed in federal archives. The cover-up was motivated by the same logic that had initially protected the Bender network. Some truths were considered too dangerous for public consumption, but secrets have a way of surviving official suppression, and the full story of Devil's Backbone Hollow lived on in whispered accounts passed down through local families, federal agents who had witnessed the excavations, and surviving members of communities that had unknowingly participated in the cannibalistic network. As America entered the 20th century, the Bender case became a footnote in frontier history, mentioned briefly in academic texts about territorial law enforcement and organized crime. The systematic murder of over 100 people was reduced to a curious historical anomaly, while the broader implications about frontier society were quietly forgotten. The site itself was eventually purchased by the federal government and designated as protected wilderness. No markers indicate what happened there. No memorials honor the victims. The land has returned to forest, and casual hikers have no way of knowing they're walking over one of America's largest unmarked graveyards. But local legends persist, passed down through generations of Alabama mountain families who remember when their ancestors spoke in hushed tones about the hollow where people went to disappear. Children are still warned away from certain areas where the ground seems softer than it should be, where wildflowers grow in unnaturally regular patterns, and where the silence feels heavy with unspoken secrets. The Bender family's executions provided legal closure, but the deeper horror of Devil's Backbone Hollow was never fully addressed. Justice was served for some crimes, while others remained buried beneath decades of secrecy and willful ignorance. Even today, forensic anthropologists occasionally petition for access to the sealed federal archives, hoping to use modern techniques to identify victims and provide closure for families whose ancestors simply vanished while traveling through Alabama in the 19th century. But those requests are routinely denied, and the official position remains that some historical secrets are better left undisturbed. The final irony of the Bender case is that their network's most successful achievement wasn't the systematic murder of innocent travelers. It was their success in convincing an entire nation that their crimes were isolated, anomalies rather than symptoms of broader societal failures that allowed organized evil to flourish in the shadows of American expansion. In the remote mountains of Alabama, where morning mist still rises from Devil's Backbone Hollow like the breath of sleeping ghosts, the land keeps its secrets well. And sometimes, on still nights when the wind carries whispers through the trees, locals swear they can still hear the sound of someone calling travelers in for supper, promising warmth and sustenance to anyone brave enough to accept their invitation. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.